In the peak of world heavyweight boxing, Riddick Bowe once stepped into a position that very few fighters could ever reach. He won the gold medal at the 2018 Seoul Olympics in the super heavyweight division, marking a perfect start to his career. When he turned professional, Bowe quickly built an impressive undefeated streak, with overwhelming power and a well-rounded fighting style rarely seen in the heavyweight division. The peak of his career came in 2022, when he defeated Evander Holyfield to become the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, unifying the WBA, WBC, and IBF belts. That moment turned him into one of the most dominant champions of the 1990s, praised by experts as a rare natural talent. During this period, Bowe did not just win fights, but dominated his opponents with physical strength, punching power, and surprising agility for a heavyweight. He took part in a classic series of fights with Holyfield, creating one of the most iconic rivalries in boxing history. The media at that time called him Big Daddy, a symbol of power and domination in the heavyweight ring. But behind that spotlight of glory was a man carrying invisible cracks within himself. Bowe grew up in poor Brooklyn, where violence and loss became part of everyday life, and that left him with a mindset that always had to fight, not only in the ring, but also in life. Every powerful punch of his seemed not only aimed at his opponent, but also a rebellion against the harsh past that had raised him. Even while standing at the top of the world, he never truly escaped the deep sense of insecurity inside, the pressure of defending his titles, the loneliness of a champion, and the heavy burden of expectations gradually wore down his spirit. When his body began to decline, Bowe's willpower became the only anchor keeping him standing. He did not give up easily, did not accept disappearing in silence, but continued fighting even when the spotlight had slowly faded. That very resilience made his journey not only a story of victories, but also proof of a man who had lived his whole life in an endless battle with fate. Before stepping into this journey, please hit subscribe and leave a like if Riddick Bowe's story touches you. It is not just a click, but a way for you to honor the journey of a warrior who grew up amid poverty and violence only to rise to the top of the world. Continuing from the early years of life that seemed like just a normal beginning, Riddick Bowe's life was quickly swallowed by the harsh rhythm of Bedford-Stuyvesant, where Brooklyn was no longer a city but became a true survival environment. There, childhood was not measured by carefree games or peaceful school days, but marked by police sirens ringing in the night, by sudden conflicts on the streets, and by the constant feeling of having to stay alert even when nothing was happening right in front of him. A large family, poor economic conditions, and the absence of proper emotional care made Bowe's life heavy from a very early age. The cramped living space, prolonged pressure to make ends meet, and wordless silences between family members created a childhood with little warmth to hold on to. In that environment, children were forced to grow up faster than normal, learning to observe before learning to dream, learning to avoid danger before understanding what the future meant. On the streets of Bedford-Stuyvesant, the sound of gunfire was not always unusual, but sometimes became part of the rhythm of life that people were forced to get used to. The old walls, dark street corners, and the always wary eyes of adults created an atmosphere in which the innocence of children was gradually eroded bit by bit. Bowe grew up amid stories of peers who gradually disappeared, some sent to jail, some falling into dead-end paths, and some simply no longer appearing. No one clearly explained those losses to a child, but all of them quietly created a heavy feeling that life never guaranteed anything would last. It was in that context that Bowe's personality gradually formed in a very special way. He became quieter, observed more, and learned to keep his emotions to himself. Silence was not a sign of weakness, but a self-protection mechanism in a world where words were sometimes not safe enough to use. He observed everything, from the eyes of adults to the way the streets changed at different times of the day, as if learning a language no one taught but everyone had to understand if they wanted to survive. Amid all that chaos, There was only one place that gave Bowe a different feeling: the old boxing gyms scattered around the neighborhood. The boxing gym was not a fancy place, had no glamour or promises of success, but it offered something the streets never had: order. When he stepped inside, the noise from outside seemed blocked, replaced by the heavy sound of punches hitting the heavy bag, the rope skipping on the floor, and the rapid breathing of people trying to push past their own limits. For Bowe, it was the first time he felt a space where he did not need to stay on guard every second. In that gym, everyone understood one simple thing: you were not judged by your past, but by how you got back up after every blow. That raw fairness made boxing the only place where he felt safe. Each training session was not only about practicing technique, but also Bowe's way of releasing pressures that could not be put into words. The powerful punches were not only directed at the heavy bag, but also carried all the tension accumulated from life outside. Sweat falling on the gym floor was not only a sign of effort, but also the way his body cleansed itself of the images and sounds of the streets. While many other kids found joy in school or games, Bowe found a strange kind of balance in the exhaustion of training. There he was no longer a forgotten child in a cold city, but someone learning to control his own body and fate, little by little. Even so, even inside the boxing gym, the darkness of Brooklyn did not completely disappear. Every time he stepped out of the gym, he returned to the old reality: risky streets, limited choices, and a future that had never been clearly drawn. But that very contrast made boxing more important than ever. It did not promise to change his life immediately, but it gave Bowe something more precious: a reason to keep standing strong. In a world where too many things could make a child fall, boxing became the only anchor keeping him from being swept away like so many other fates in that neighborhood. Continuing from the first days of finding shelter in the boxing gym, Riddick Bowe's life began to enter a new phase, where existence was no longer just a reaction to the surrounding environment, but gradually became a process shaped by discipline and willpower. At that time, Bowe did not have a solid technical foundation like young fighters trained in a professional system. He did not know much about tactics, did not deeply understand defensive principles or subtle movements, and also did not have a clear roadmap to become a real athlete. But what made him different lay elsewhere. His body had been forged very early by the streets of Brooklyn themselves, where quick reactions, vigilance, and the ability to endure pressure were not choices but necessities for survival. In the first training sessions, the coaches quickly realized that Bowe was not an ordinary student. Although lacking technique, he possessed an astonishing natural strength, along with the ability to maintain balance and react under pressure that many people took years to achieve. His punches were not formed from books, but from the survival instinct deeply embedded in his body. Every time he faced the heavy bag, there was no hesitation or complicated calculation, only a raw but powerful flow of energy, as if all the years growing up in a dangerous environment were being transformed into impact force. That was what made the coaches start paying more attention, not because he was already good, but because they saw in him something very rare: untapped potential. The following training sessions were no longer simply physical activity, but became a rigorous process of training both body and mind. Sweat flowed not only because of fatigue, but because the training intensity kept increasing as the coaches tried to turn Bowe's natural instinct into a real fighting system. Repetitive drills, strict demands on posture, movement rhythm, and distance control forced him to relearn almost everything from scratch. But instead of resisting that discipline, Bowe accepted it as an inevitable part of the path he had chosen. For him, every drop of sweat falling on the gym floor was not only hardship, but also a small step out of the old unstable life. Gradually, what happened in the gym began to change. Bowe's punches were no longer just pure reflexes, but started to carry clearer control and purpose. He learned to control his breathing, learned to observe opponents, and more importantly, learned not to let emotions overwhelm every movement. This transformation did not happen quickly but was the result of hundreds of hours of repeated training, where body and mind gradually adapted to a completely new form of discipline. However, what made Bowe special still did not change. The survival instinct foundation from the streets was always present inside him, creating a rare combination between raw power and quick adaptability. In the eyes of the coaches, Bowe was not just a strong boy, but was gradually becoming a young fighter with potential that could go beyond the local level. They began to see in him the image of someone who could go far if guided in the right direction. But along with that potential was an unavoidable reality. Everything had to be built from zero. There were no shortcuts, no favors, only discipline, perseverance, and the ability to endure ever-increasing pressure. In that process, Bowe also began to change from within. He was no longer just a child reacting to the world around him, but became the one actively shaping his own reactions. Each training session not only made him stronger physically, but also helped him understand his own limits more clearly. There were days when his body was so exhausted he could barely lift his arms, but he still continued to stand up, because deep down he understood that stopping meant returning to the old life. That choice, repeated in silence, created the first foundation for a real fighter. Over time, the image of a young fighter full of potential began to form more clearly in the eyes of those around him, not because he was perfect, but because his progress could not be ignored. From a boy who walked into the gym with pure instinct, Bowe gradually became someone who could control his own power, turning it into a tool instead of an unconscious reflex. And in that very process, a new path began to open. A path that took him from a child born into poverty to one of the most notable names of the young boxing generation at that time. Continuing the journey forged from survival instinct into fighting skills, the biggest turning point in Riddick Bowe's life came when he stepped into the 2018 Olympic arena, where dream, pressure, and destiny first clearly intersected. It was no longer training sessions in the old Brooklyn gym, nor sparring sessions for practice, but a global stage where every movement was observed, analyzed, and evaluated by the whole world. When he put on the United States team uniform, Bowe carried not only the boxing skills honed over time, but also the story of a boy who grew up on the streets where there was no protection other than himself. The 2018 Olympics became the place where all those years were tested at the highest level. On the road to the gold medal, Bowe displayed a fighting style that was both powerful and fully controlled. Each match was a step forward, not only technically, but also psychologically. He was no longer the boy who only reacted by instinct, but had become a fighter who knew how to adjust pace, observe opponents, and use his strength in a calculated way. As each opponent was overcome one by one, attention began to focus on him. International media quickly noticed a new name rising in the super heavyweight division, a fighter who not only had an impressive physique, but also possessed rare calmness at such a young age. Articles, interviews, and camera lenses began to appear more and more, turning Bowe from a young athlete into a potential symbol of American boxing. But along with the light of attention came an invisible pressure that grew larger. As he advanced deeper into the tournament, Bowe was not only fighting for himself, but also becoming a representative for an entire boxing program looking for the next generation. Every punch was no longer simply technique, but carried the expectations of coaches, the team, and an entire nation. That pressure did not come from opponents in the ring, but from the feeling that all eyes were waiting for him to prove something bigger than himself. However, in the most tense moments, Bowe still maintained his characteristic calmness. He did not show too much emotion, did not show off, but instead showed an almost cold focus, as if everything around him had shrunk down to just him and his opponent. When the final match ended and the 2018 Olympic gold medal was awarded to him, the world witnessed for the first time that Riddick Bowe was no longer a potential name, but a real champion. The moment the American flag was raised, the music played, and the lights shone across the arena, all created an image that any athlete would crave. But for Bowe, that feeling was not completely whole as people thought. Victory brought glory and recognition, but it did not bring the inner peace he had never truly had. After the Olympics, Bowe's life changed almost immediately. From a young fighter on the team, he became a name chased by the media, noticed by managers, and closely watched by the professional boxing world. Invitations, contracts, and new opportunities appeared continuously, opening a completely different door from what he had known. However, that too-fast change also brought a disruption that was not immediately noticeable. As everything outside became bigger, faster, and louder, inside Bowe was still a person trying to find balance between a poor past and a present full of light. Even while standing at the peak of Olympic glory, the feeling of mental stability had never truly come to him. Success for the first time opened a larger world, but at the same time made him realize that victory did not automatically erase the scars from the past. Deep down, Bowe still carried the image of Brooklyn, of the days of survival, and of a child who once did not know what tomorrow would bring. And that very contrast between global glory and inner instability became an inseparable part of his journey from that point onward. Continuing from the moment of the 2018 Olympic gold medal, when the world first saw the light from a young champion, Riddick Bowe's journey entered a completely different chapter, where glory no longer came from amateur competitions, but from the harsh world of professional boxing. This was no longer a stage of national honor or symbolic fights, but an arena where every punch had value like a contract, where mistakes were not forgiven, and where a fighter's existence depended on the ability to adapt faster than opponents. Bowe entered that environment with the ready-made fame from the Olympics, but what he soon realized was that a glorious past could not guarantee the future. Right from the first professional fights, Bowe quickly created an impressive winning streak. Natural strength, superior physique, and the ability to overwhelm opponents helped him surpass many notable names in a short time. Without needing too much accumulated experience, he could still control the pace of the fight with heavy jab punches like sledgehammers and constant pressure when closing in. Each victory not only consolidated his position in the rankings, but also sent a clear message to the boxing world. A new heavyweight force was forming. Bowe's image in the ring gradually became intimidating in a very natural way. He was not the loud or flashy type of fighter, but his presence in the ring brought a heavy feeling of pressure to opponents. When the bell rang, each of his movements carried certainty, as if the entire surrounding space was being narrowed with every step forward. Opponents not only had to face physical strength, but also had to endure the constant feeling of being pressed, as if there was no safe escape throughout the fight. It did not take long for international media to begin paying attention to the name Riddick Bowe, not just as a former Olympic champion, but as a real candidate for the professional heavyweight throne. Analyses began to appear, describing him as a fighter who possessed a rare combination of natural power, pace adjustment ability, and calmness in high-pressure situations. Commentators began to place him next to the big names of the era, not as a young talent anymore, but as a real threat to the current order of heavyweight boxing. As his fame rose quickly, Bowe's life also changed in an irreversible way. Attention from the media, praise, and ever-growing expectations from fans created an environment where he always had to prove himself with every appearance. Each new victory no longer brought a simple feeling as before, but became a heavier step on a path that people began to look at with anticipation. However, behind that strong development, a quiet reality still existed. Bowe's psychology had never been completely stable. Although on the outside he was the image of a rising fighter with terrifying power, inside he still carried the complexity of a person who grew up in poverty and survival pressure, memories from Brooklyn, years of uncertainty about the future, and the too-fast transition from Olympics to professional created a psychological gap that victories could not always fill. There were times, even after leaving the ring with victory in hand, Bowe still did not feel he had achieved real balance. That very contrast created a special image in the early stage of his professional career. A fighter who could dominate opponents in just a few rounds, but was still on the journey to find stability within himself. His fame grew fast, the stage lights grew brighter, but the mental foundation had not yet adapted to that speed. And from here, a real heavyweight force had formed in world boxing, not only with physical power, but also with a complex story gradually unfolding behind each victory. Continuing the streak of pressured but convincing victories in the early professional career, Riddick Bowe's journey finally led him to the destined moment, the fight with Evander Holyfield, a confrontation that was not only about titles, but also a clash between two generations, two styles, and two unyielding wills in heavyweight boxing history. This was no longer simply a fight, but the moment that decided a person's place in the entire structure of world boxing. When he stepped into the ring, Bowe carried not only the strength and skills honed over many years, but also all the expectations of a fighter standing at the threshold of becoming the undisputed champion. The fight took place in a tense atmosphere, where every eye and every movement was scrutinized under the pressure of history. Holyfield was an experienced, disciplined, and resilient champion, while Bowe brought youth, superior physique, and an almost instinctive confidence. From the early rounds, the matchup clearly showed the difference in style. Holyfield fought with resilience and calculation, while Bowe dominated with power and constant pressure. Each exchange of blows was not only tactics, but a test of the limits of two people standing at the peak of heavyweight boxing. As the fight went on, Bowe's dominance in size and power began to make the difference. He continuously pressed his opponent, forcing Holyfield to move more, take more punches, and fight at a pace that only special fighters could maintain. Each round that passed was one step closer to the historic moment. And when the final bell rang, the name Riddick Bowe was announced as the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. That moment marked the global peak of his fame. From a boy who grew up on the poor streets of Brooklyn to an Olympic fighter, and now the champion who unified the biggest belts in world boxing, that journey was praised by international media as a classic rags-to-riches story in sports. Articles, interviews, and recognition from the world's top boxing experts all called him one of the most dominant heavyweight fighters of the era. The title not only brought money and fame, but also placed him at the center of boxing history, where only the greatest names could exist. However, behind that spotlight, what the public did not see was the increasingly clear inner silence inside Bowe. When the cheers of the crowd gradually died down, when the stage lights went out, and when he returned to himself, the feeling of victory did not bring the release people usually thought. The peak he reached did not open a state of peace, but created a new emptiness, a feeling that after standing above everything, there was nothing clear left to pursue except protecting that position. The recognition from the international boxing world made this pressure even heavier. Every appearance after that was no longer a journey of conquest, but a task of maintaining the image of an undisputed champion. And in that very moment when he stood at the peak, a quiet truth existed. Fame could take a person to the highest position, but it did not guarantee they would find stability within themselves. That was the first paradox Bowe had to face in the journey of a champion, where victory was not the end, but only the beginning of a new pressure that could not be seen with the naked eye. Continuing from the moment when the entire boxing world had to acknowledge Riddick Bowe's supreme position after the historic victory over Evander Holyfield, the glory of the undisputed heavyweight championship belt was no longer just a symbol of honor, but gradually became an invisible burden weighing on his entire life. When standing at the top of the world, Bowe was no longer the conqueror, but the one who had to defend everything he had earned. And that very shift completely changed the way he lived, trained, and existed in the harsh boxing world. The pressure of defending the championship title began to appear in every small detail of daily life. There were no longer training sessions with free development. Everything now revolved around maintaining the #1 position. Each new opponent was not just a challenge, but a direct threat to the image he had built. Praise from the past was gradually replaced by non-stop rising expectations from experts, media, and fans. No one asked anymore whether he could win or not, but only how long he could continue to dominate. That change in expectations turned the championship belt from a reward into a heavy responsibility. Bowe's fighting and training intensity in this period reached a brutal level. Each training session was no longer simply technical practice, but a continuous test of physical and mental limits. Long sparring sessions, strength and endurance exercises pushed to the maximum, all aimed at ensuring he was always ready for any opponent. But the human body, no matter how strong, has limits. After many years of competing at the highest level, signs of fatigue began to appear. Reactions were no longer as quick as before. Movements were no longer as light as in the peak period. And recovery after training also gradually slowed down. The fatigue did not only exist physically, but also crept into the psychology of a champion. Bowe no longer stepped into the ring with the free feeling as before, but instead with a clear awareness of the risk of every fight. A small mistake could not only make him lose the match, but also collapse the entire image he had built. This pressure made every fight a continuous mental test, where he had to fight both the opponent and the expectations placed on his shoulders. Meanwhile, the image of the undisputed champion began to create an invisible constraint. The more he was honored, the more Bowe was trapped in the framework of that very title. He was no longer allowed to show weakness, no longer had space for mistakes, and also had no room for real rest. Every action was scrutinized under the view of a champion who must always be perfect. That made him gradually feel like he was living in armor that was too tight, both protecting and suffocating him. The feeling of being trapped in his own image became clearer over time. The man who once rose to the top of the world with strength and survival instinct now had to face a different reality. Not every victory brought freedom. Instead of being liberated after reaching the peak, Bowe was pulled deeper into the responsibility of greatness. And in the silence between training sessions, between fights, and between the words of praise, a quiet truth existed. Sometimes the heaviest thing is not failure, but having to continue standing at the peak for too long without being allowed to fall. Continuing from the period when the undisputed heavyweight championship belt gradually became an invisible burden, weighing on every aspect of life. Riddick Bowe's journey entered a turning point moment where invincibility was no longer reality and the spotlight began to show its first cracks. His first loss in the peak of his career was not just a sports result, but a turning event that changed the entire way the world viewed a champion once considered unbeatable. On that day, the atmosphere before the fight still carried the familiar expectation. Bowe stepped into the ring with the title of champion, with the responsibility of defending the position built through many years of victories. But when the fight took place, everything no longer operated on the familiar orbit. His opponent brought not only strength and tactics, but also a pace that Bowe could no longer control as before. The periods that once were his advantage now became moments to be exploited. And when the final bell rang, the result no longer favored the champion. The championship belt had left his hands. The moment of losing the belt was not only a change in title, but a profound mental shock. For a fighter who had once stood at the absolute peak, no longer holding the number one position meant not only a sports meaning, but also touched his personal identity. In a brief moment, everything he had built, from domination, fame, to the image of invincibility, was placed in a completely different light. And the heaviest thing was not the failure itself, but the feeling that an important part of himself had just been taken away. Right after the loss, the way the world viewed Bowe began to change markedly. The media, which had once praised him as a symbol of absolute power, now shifted to analyzing weaknesses, signs of decline, and questions about the future. Words of praise no longer carried affirmation, but gradually turned into doubt. From the position of an untouchable champion, Bowe began to be placed in the group of those on the downward path. That change in perception did not happen gradually but almost immediately. Like a natural reflex of the sports world when a peak is broken. Internally, Bowe's confidence also began to show its first cracks, not because he no longer had the ability to fight, but because the absolute certainty that once existed in him was no longer intact. The first loss not only raised questions about the opponent, but also forced him to confront himself, whether the previous domination was the result of real strength or just a period when all factors were on his side. Those questions had no clear answers, but they were strong enough to shake the psychological foundation of a champion who once believed he could not be defeated. The pressure from external expectations, which had existed before, now became heavier than ever. When he was still the champion, Bowe had to endure the pressure of keeping the belt. But after losing it, he had to face the pressure of proving that he was not finished. Each return to the ring, he no longer fought only to defend the title, but also to protect his own honor in the eyes of the public. The expectation did not disappear but only changed shape, becoming a new burden no less harsh. And in the gap between a glorious past and a present full of doubt, Bowe began to feel more clearly the isolation of a champion who had fallen. No longer absolute certainty, no longer the feeling of invincibility, only a journey full of pressure where every step was scrutinized. The first loss not only changed the record, but also marked the end of a phase in his life. The phase where everything seemed to always operate in the direction of victory. Continuing from the shock of the first loss, when the undisputed heavyweight championship belt left Riddick Bowe's hands, his journey not only changed in status in the boxing world, but also began to enter a much harsher phase, the physical decline over time. This was no longer the story of a champion defending his title, but the story of a body that had once reached its peak, now facing the unavoidable law of youth gradually passing. At first, the changes came very quietly. There was no clear moment marking the end of the peak period, but only small signs that gradually accumulated through each training session and each fight. The movements that were once very agile began to slow down by a beat. The reflexes that were once almost instinctive no longer appeared instantly as before. In boxing, where even a fraction of a second could decide the outcome, these small changes gradually became a large gap between victory and defeat. Along with time, the weight issue also began to affect Bowe. After the peak period, his body could no longer maintain the ideal balance as before. Weight gain happened gradually, not dramatically, but enough to change the feeling when stepping into the ring. A heavyweight fighter might not be limited by weight like other divisions, but flexibility, speed, and the ability to maintain fight pace depended heavily on physical condition. When the body became heavier, each movement consumed more energy, and each punch was no longer as sharp as in the peak period. This change not only affected technique, but also changed the entire way Bowe perceived himself in the fight. There was a time when he stepped into the ring with an almost absolute feeling of control, where every movement happened naturally and precisely. But when physical condition declined, that feeling gradually disappeared, replaced by the effort to catch up with the fight pace instead of imposing it. Situations that were once handled easily now became heavier, requiring more calculation and effort to achieve similar effectiveness. Boxing, from a sport that Bowe once dominated with strength and instinct, now became a continuous challenge. Each fight no longer brought an absolute confidence, but became a harsh test of physical limits. Younger, faster, and more durable opponents began to create clear difficulties. No longer the one-sided domination as before. The fights now lasted longer, were more tense, and consumed more both physically and mentally. The hardest thing was not winning or losing, but the feeling that the body no longer responded as expected. For a fighter who once relied on the combination of power and agility, losing part of that natural ability felt like losing part of his identity. There were moments on the ring where Bowe could clearly feel the slowdown in his reflexes, but could not change it immediately. The gap between willpower and actual ability created an increasingly large psychological distance. The feeling of no longer being himself in the ring began to become a difficult reality to accept, not because he was no longer a fighter, but because the image reflected in the mirror on the ring no longer resembled the person who once stood at the top of the world. The movements that once carried domination now became heavier. The moments once full of confidence now replaced by caution and hesitation. In boxing, where personal identity was directly tied to physical performance, this change had a much deeper nature than a normal decline. And in that process, the most painful thing was not the decline of the body, but the increasingly clear awareness that the peak period could not return. Each fight, each training session, each moment on the ring reminded him that the body that once helped Bowe conquer the world was now operating under a different law. That very confrontation turned this period into one of the harshest challenges in his entire journey. Not a battle with opponents, but a battle with the limits of time, continuing from the stage where the body began to betray the expectations once placed on it. Riddick Bowe's journey turned to an unavoidable fork, completely leaving the peak of heavyweight boxing. This was no longer the story of a fighter declining in form, but the transition from bright stage lights to a normal life where there were no more cheers, no more titles, and no more natural mechanisms to define himself as before. When leaving the peak of his career, Bowe not only left the ring, but also left a world where he once was the center. For many years, his life had been shaped by fight schedules, training sessions, and continuous preparation for big matches. But when all of that stopped, a large void appeared, not only in the daily schedule, but also in the very perception of himself. With no more opponents, no clear goals, and no direct pressure to maintain the #1 position, he entered a phase that many great athletes had faced. Life after glory. The stage lights that once covered every step of Bowe now disappeared completely. There were no more press conferences, no more attention from international media, and no more feeling of being watched by the whole world every time he stepped into the ring. Silence replaced the noise of big fights. And that very silence, seemingly peaceful, became a new form of pressure, harder to name than any opponent who had ever stood across from him in the ring. Along with moving away from the spotlight, financial pressures also began to appear more clearly. In the peak period, income from big fights and endorsement contracts had once brought Bowe a stable and comfortable life, but when his career ended, that income stream no longer maintained its previous level. The transition from a top athlete to ordinary life was never easy, and for Bowe, this change brought more challenges than expected. Living expenses, personal responsibilities, and maintaining life after sports became a new reality he was forced to face. Fame, which had once surrounded him like an inseparable halo, also began to gradually fade over time. New names appeared in boxing, new champions took over media attention, and memories of Bowe's domination period gradually receded into the background in the flow of sports history. Although his name was still mentioned in discussions about heavyweight legends, his presence in current life was no longer as strong as before. From someone once followed by the whole world, he became part of the past recalled more often than the present unfolding. The mental void after retirement became one of the biggest challenges Bowe had to face. For many years, boxing was not only a career, but also the structure that shaped his entire life. Everything from daily habits, relationships, to the way he viewed himself revolved around the ring. When that structure disappeared, a large emptiness appeared where the definition of self was no longer as clear as before. With no more fighting goals, no more competition pressure, and no more feeling of being challenged every day, he had to confront a completely different kind of silence. The silence of the end. In that void, the hardest thing was not material shortage or lack of attention, but finding meaning for himself again. A person once defined by victories and titles now had to learn to exist without them, and that very change turned the post-career period into a complex inner journey, where past glory was no longer enough to fill the present. and where each passing day was a reminder that the stage lights had truly closed behind him. Continuing from the prolonged mental void after leaving the stage lights, Riddick Bowe's life did not completely close with boxing immediately. Although he had passed the peak period, there still existed in him an old instinct, the part of a champion who once stood at the top of the world, always whispering that there might still be a chance to return. That very thing led to returns to the ring, not as a natural continuation of his career, but as an emotional effort to hold on to what once belonged to the past. Those returns did not carry the glamour as before. There was no longer the atmosphere of a dominating champion, no longer certainty in every movement, and no longer the feeling that everything was under control. Instead, there was a different reality, where each fight carried doubt, both from outside and from within himself. Although he still carried the name of a former heavyweight champion, when stepping into the ring, Bowe had to face a completely different version of himself. A body that had endured much wear, slower reactions, and no longer maintained the explosion of the peak period. In those comeback fights, the gap between past and present became clearer than ever. Younger, faster, and more energetic opponents made each fight a heavy challenge. No longer domination from the start, no longer the ability to end the fight with pure power. Bowe had to enter longer, harder battles that demanded more physically, and it was in those moments that the limits of time began to reveal themselves clearly, without explanation. The results of those returns did not meet the expectations many had attached to his name. Although there were still moments showing experience and courage, they were no longer enough to compensate for the natural decline of the body. Each fight no longer carried the meaning of affirming status, but became efforts to prove that he could still exist in the environment that once belonged to him. However, that existence became more fragile with each step into the ring. Hidden deep inside those returns was a feeling hard to name, the feeling of trying to hold on to the past, not the past in the sense of memories, but the past of a version of a person who once knew no limits, who once believed he could dominate any opponent in front of him. But as time passed, the body no longer responded, and reality no longer allowed the repetition of what had once happened. Each fight, therefore, was not only a sports competition, but also a silent dialogue between the current person and the person in memory. In each round, each moment of movement on the floor, Bowe had to face a truth that became clearer. Boxing never stops, but the human body has limits. Each punch, each reaction slower by a beat, each moment of shortness of breath reminded him that the peak period had stayed behind. And although the will was still there, although the fighting spirit had never completely disappeared, the gap between desire and actual ability became increasingly difficult to narrow. Each time stepping down from the ring after comeback fights, Bowe carried not only the result, but also the feeling of directly confronting his own change. No longer the dominating champion, no longer the unbeatable fighter, he became a person trying to understand his own limits in a world that no longer waited for him. And that very truth turned each return into a step closer to the acknowledgement that there were moments in life that could not be repeated, no matter how strong the will. Continuing from the returns to the ring that no longer brought glory as before, Riddick Bowe's life stepped deeper into a phase where boxing was no longer the center but still quietly dominated every aspect of his existence. When the stage lights had gradually turned off and the cheers no longer rang out every time his name was called, a new reality appeared. Life outside sports, where there was no bell for rounds, no referee, and no clear boundary between victory and defeat. Bowe's personal life in this period became more volatile than ever. With no longer the tight structure of fight schedules or gym sessions, he had to face a much more complex world. The world of relationships, responsibilities, and decisions that no longer carried a sports nature but a real survival nature. Changes in personal life did not occur in a clear order, but came sporadically, sometimes unexpectedly, creating a prolonged feeling of instability. Family and financial responsibilities became an inseparable part of this new life. Throughout his peak career, income from big fights had once brought Bowe stability and a high level of control over life. But when the career was no longer at its peak, those financial responsibilities continued to exist, even becoming heavier over time. Maintaining life for himself and his family, along with obligations arising from the past, created a prolonged pressure with no clear relief. With no more big contracts, no more bonuses from important fights, he was forced to face a reality completely different from the glorious period. In that context, long-term instability became a familiar part of life. With no longer a clear center to orient everything, Bowe's life no longer revolved around a single goal as when he was competing. Instead, there was dispersion among many different responsibilities, from personal life to everyday practical issues. This instability was not only reflected in the material aspect, but also present in psychology, as he had to continuously adapt to a life that no longer had a clear structure as before. Although time passed, pressure from the past still did not disappear. The image of a heavyweight champion who once dominated the world always went with his name, creating an invisible standard by which any aspect of current life was compared. The glorious past was both pride and a burden, because it made every current difficulty become clearer when placed next to a period when everything seemed at its peak. That very coexistence made Bowe never able to completely separate himself from the career that had passed, even though he no longer stood in the ring. In the silences of ordinary life, loneliness gradually became a more evident factor. When there was no longer a career as the center, no more daily fighting goals, and no more public attention as before, a void appeared in the rhythm of his life. Days without training schedules or preparation for big fights made time feel longer, and in that extension, the feeling of separation from the surrounding world gradually formed. With no longer a clear role as before, Bowe had to face a question harder than any opponent who had ever stood in the ring. Who am I when I am no longer a competing fighter? This loneliness was not the absence of people around, but the absence of a structure that defined the self. For many years, boxing was not only a career, but also an identity. When that element no longer occupied the central position, everything else became looser, harder to shape. And it was in that emptiness that pressure from the past, present responsibilities, and future instability intersected, creating a complex period in his life, where fighting no longer took place in the ring but in daily life, quietly and prolonged. Continuing from the volatile and unstable period of life outside sports, Riddick Bowe's journey turned to a new reality where he was no longer the center of the boxing world, but only a name recalled in the memories of times that had passed. While he was trying to adapt to post-career life, the boxing world did not stop. It continued moving forward, faster, younger, and more ruthless in the way it replaced old symbols with new faces. New generations of heavyweight fighters began to appear, bringing different fighting styles, different physiques, and a completely different pace from Bowe's era. New names dominated the media, rankings were renewed, and public attention gradually shifted to new fights, new stories, and new champions. In that non-stop flow, Bowe's position in the public mind also gradually changed. From a champion who once dominated the heavyweight division, he became part of history recalled, rather than a figure present in the present. This replacement did not happen suddenly, but gradually, over time, almost naturally, as the way sports always operated. But for Bowe, that feeling carried a deeper personal nature. When he had once been at the center of all attention, witnessing the world shift to other names created a clear distance between past and present. The big fights that once had his name were now replaced by new events. The analyses that once revolved around his fighting style now shifted to analyzing the next generation. And in that shift, the feeling of being forgotten began to form quietly, but clearly. The feeling of being forgotten did not come from a specific moment, but from the accumulation of many small details. A time when he was no longer mentioned in big discussions. A new ranking that no longer included his name. a big fight taking place without any connection to the period he once dominated. All of those things, when added up over time, created an unavoidable awareness. The world had continued moving forward without needing to wait for him. The gap between past and present became increasingly clear when looking back at the entire journey. In memory, Bowe had once been a powerful heavyweight fighter, an undisputed champion who once stood at the top of the world after victory over Evander Holyfield. But in the present, he was no longer in that position. The difference between the two versions of himself lay not only in achievements but also in the feeling of existing in the boxing world. One side was domination and the center of all eyes. The other was the retreat into the background of a legend who once defined an entire era. However, although the world had changed, the memory of Bowe's golden period still did not disappear. The peak fights, the moments of domination, and the image of a young champion who once stepped to the top of the world were still recalled in discussions about boxing history. In the eyes of experts, he was still seen as one of the most talented heavyweight fighters to ever appear, a person who possessed a rare combination of power, speed, and the ability to control fights. Those memories became an inseparable part of boxing history, existing parallel to the present even though they no longer directly influenced it. For Bowe, the memory of the peak period was both pride and something hard to grasp. It reminded him of the person he once was, of what he had achieved, but at the same time also clarified the distance between past and present. As the world continued moving forward, he was forced to face an unchangeable reality. Glory did not stand still, and peaks of the past would eventually become memories. And it was in the intersection between the forgetting of the present and the light of the past that the image of an old champion still existed, no longer at the center but still unable to be completely erased from the history he had helped create, continuing from the feeling that the boxing world had moved on without waiting for him anymore. Riddick Bowe's journey gradually shifted to another phase, where he was no longer seen as a competing fighter but became part of an already shaped history. But unlike the forgetting that many once feared, his name did not disappear. It remained clear, solid, and impossible to erase from discussions about heavyweight boxing. This was the time when his career was looked back on, not through the lens of current pressure, but through the evaluation of time. When looking back at the entire career of Riddick Bowe, people did not just see a series of fights, but saw a journey full of ups and downs where victory and defeat always went hand in hand. From a boy who grew up in poverty in Brooklyn, he stepped out into the world through the path of boxing, winning the gold medal at the 1988 Seoul Olympics, then going straight to the professional peak with the historic victory over Evander Holyfield to become the undisputed heavyweight champion. Those were moments that any fighter would dream of, peaks that very few in history could reach. But alongside that glory were periods of decline, losses, and moments when the body and time began to set limits that could not be overcome. It was the coexistence of victory and defeat that created a story more complex than any simple record. Bowe was not a flawless, perfect champion, but he was also not an athlete who only knew failure. He was the combination of both extremes. A person who had once stood at the top of the world and had also had to face the unavoidable decline of his own body. And that very truth made his career more human, more relatable, and also deeper in the eyes of longtime boxing followers. Over time, the respect from the expert community for Bowe did not diminish, but was even reshaped at a deeper level. Coaches, former fighters, and boxing analysts looked back at his career not only through the number of wins or titles, but through the way he once dominated the heavyweight division in his peak period. They saw in him a fighter who possessed a rare combination of natural power, reflexes, and calmness under pressure. Even the later losses could not erase the impression of a champion who had truly changed the landscape of the world heavyweight division at a certain point. Bowe's legacy in heavyweight boxing history therefore did not lie only in titles, but in the position he held in the memory of the sport. He was part of an era when heavyweight boxing still carried direct confrontation, where power and instinct played a role as important as tactics. His fights, especially the series against Holyfield, were still recalled as classic examples of peak competition, where two fighters not only fought to win, but also to redefine each other's limits. Overall, Bowe was not the model of perfection, and that very thing made his true value. He did not follow a pre-paved path, did not maintain a flawless career, and did not end his story with a perfect image. Instead, he was a legend full of both light and darkness, both peaks and decline, both glory and wounds. And that very imperfection made him truer in the eyes of history. At the present time, when looking back at the entire journey, what remained was not only the belts or the fights, but the feeling about a person who had once stood at the center of the boxing world, and then gradually stepped out of that light in a way that was, not loud, but full of imprint. Riddick Bowe still stood there in heavyweight boxing history, not as a perfect symbol, but as a living legend who had once won, once fallen, and once stood up in his own very unique way. Continuing from the lines of respectful reflection for a legend who still remained in the memory of boxing, Riddick Bowe's journey reached its conclusion not with a single moment of collapse, but with a long process of fighting, glory, decline, and confronting himself. This was not just the story of a heavyweight champion, but the story of a person who had lived his entire life in a state of fighting, in the ring, in the gym, and even in the silences of life after the stage lights. From a child who grew up amid poverty in Brooklyn, where the streets of Bedford-Stuyvesant were never truly safe, Bowe had stepped out into the world through a path almost no one believed was possible. With no privileges, no perfect foundation, he built himself from the harsh days of survival, where boxing was not a career choice, but an escape from disappearing. It was from that environment that a fighter carrying both physical power and survival will was formed. That journey took him to the peak of world sports, the gold medal at the 1988 Olympics, and then the peak of professional glory when he defeated Evander Holyfield to become the undisputed heavyweight champion. Those were moments when the world recognized him as one of the most outstanding heavyweight fighters of his generation. But what made Bowe's story was not only those victories, but the entire long chain of the journey afterward, where glory did not stand still, and the human body began to pay the price for years of non-stop fighting. His life, when looked back on, was not a straight line going up to the peak and then stopping, but a continuous series of movements between victory and challenge, between recognition and doubt, between peaks and periods of decline. After the domination period, losses began to appear. Physical condition could no longer be maintained as before, and the boxing world continued moving forward with new generations. But throughout all those changes, what never disappeared was Bowe's fighting nature. No matter in any phase, he always entered the game with the same spirit, not retreating easily, not accepting disappearing in silence, and always finding a way to stand firm even when the body was no longer in perfect condition. As the spotlight gradually receded, what remained was not a sudden end, but the pieces of a life that had been lived too fully in pressure and high intensity. The old fights, the glorious moments, the losses, and even the incomplete returns, all blended together to create a picture more complex than any simple title could describe. There, Riddick Bowe was not only a champion, but a person who had devoted almost his entire life to facing challenges, both when winning and when no longer standing at the peak. What remained after the spotlight was not perfection, but the memory of a real warrior, a person who had once stood at the top of the world, who had once been tested by time, and who had once had to face his own limits in a way that only athletes at the highest level could understand. When looking back, his life could not be summarized by a single title or a single failure, but had to be seen as a continuous journey of effort, sometimes brilliant, sometimes heavy, but never completely stopping. And it was at this point that Riddick Bowe's story carried a deeper tragic shade than any single failure. Not because he fell in one moment, but because he had lived a life where fighting became instinct, and when time no longer allowed fighting at the peak, that transition became more painful than any punch that had ever appeared in the ring. His tragedy did not lie in the fact that he had failed, but in the fact that he had fought too long, too deeply, and too truly in a world that always demanded perfection, that no one could maintain forever. Time did not defeat him in a single fight, but gradually eroded layer after layer of strength, beat after beat of reflexes, layer after layer of confidence, until only a person who had once been a champion remained, but still always carried within him the spirit of a warrior who never truly stopped. When looking back at the entire journey of Riddick Bowe, people did not only see a heavyweight champion who had once reached the top of the world, but also saw a person swept away in the very vortex of poverty, glory, and the erosion of time. From the harsh streets of Brooklyn, where his childhood was tied to violence and deprivation, to the moment standing at the top of the world after victory over Evander Holyfield, his life was clear proof that a person could rise from what seemed impossible. But what made this story painful did not lie in the glory, but in the way that glory gradually turned into a burden over time. What he achieved in his career could not cover up the truth that the body, psychology, and post-sports life always had to pay the price for years of non-stop fighting. When looking at the physical decline, the weight gains after the peak, and the feeling of being lost in the incomplete returns to the ring, people saw clearly one thing: no one could stand at the top forever. But for Bowe, what was even more painful was that he not only left the peak, but also had to face the feeling that he no longer belonged to the place that had once made his name. The post-career periods, with financial pressure, loneliness, and mental voids, showed that victory in sports did not mean peace in life. From his story, Americans can draw a clear lesson. Success is never the ending point, but only a part of a longer journey called life. The spotlight can lift a person very high, but if there is no preparation for the phase afterward, that very spotlight can become a burden. Riddick Bowe is not a story of failure, but a reminder that even the strongest people have limits, and the true value of a person lies not only in what they have gained, but also in the way they continue to exist when they are no longer at the peak. If the story of Riddick Bowe has touched you, please hit subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring the journeys full of glory, but also full of losses of sports legends. Thank you for accompanying us, and see you again in the next video, where we will continue to look deeper into the stories behind the spotlight that few have ever known.